The wind on the open plains cut like a knife, stripping away heat faster than a fire could give it. For cowboys working the frontier, winter was not just another season. It was a test of endurance, a season that could make or break a man's spirit and sometimes even take his life. There were no insulated coats, no electric heaters, no snowplows clearing paths through the drifts. Out here, survival was a matter of wit, grit, and an uncanny ability to wrest life from a landscape that seemed intent on ending it. To ride through the Great Plains in January, or to camp in the Rocky Mountain foothills in December was to gamble with frostbite, starvation, and storms that could roll down without warning and swallow the horizon in sheets of white. And yet cowboys managed, somehow with little more than wool leather and a fire they built with their own hands. They carved out survival in winters that would send most of us running for shelter. The first trick to survival began long before the snow fell. Cowboys knew that winter was not a surprise. The seasons told their story in advance, and preparation meant the difference between life and death. Before the last of the autumn grass turned brittle, herds were driven to winter range, lower valleys where winds were less savage and some grazing might last through the snow. Cattle could root for food beneath the crust of snow, but only if the pastures were chosen well. So in late fall, men scouted, choosing spots near rivers or sheltered canyons where the land itself offered protection. The cowboys who lived through winter were the ones who planned ahead. They cut extra firewood where trees grew thick, stored jerky and beans, and patched gear until it could withstand at least a few more months of strain. They oiled their saddles, wrapped rawhide around worn boots, and stitched tiers and blankets that would soon be all that stood between them and the merciless cold. When the first snow hit, the work never stopped. Cattle did not care that the temperature had dropped below freezing. They still needed watching because storms could scatter them, freeze them, or drive them into canyons where they would be lost. So cowboys rode out, often for hours at a time, snow stinging their faces, breath freezing in their mustaches, hands stiff on the reins. They had no thermal gloves, only mittens of wool or leather, sometimes layered with grease or wax to block the wind. They learned to tuck their hands under their armpits, keeping blood flowing while still gripping reins. Scarves of wool or cotton were pulled high across faces, stiffening with frost but guarding skin against the burn of icy gusts. Their coats were often nothing more than sheepskin or heavy canvas dusters, lined with wool if they were lucky. In bitter cold, 2 or 3 shirts layered beneath might keep the wind from breaking them entirely. But there were nights when frost gathered inside collars, and the only warmth came from constant movement. At night, survival meant fire. Always fire. Cowboys became masters of coaxing flame from the stingiest kindling, because without it, frostbite and hypothermia were only hours away. In the open prairie where trees were scarce, they gathered dried buffalo chips, the hardened dung of bison, a resource as valuable as gold in the frozen plains. It burned slow, hot, and steady, and more than one cowboy owed his life to a pile of buffalo chips glowing red in the night. Around that fire they huddled in bedrolls made of canvas and wool, sometimes layering saddles and horse blankets over their bodies. Their cocoon, as they called it, was often a single thick wool blanket wrapped tight to trap whatever warmth a body could muster. Some men spread tarps or oiled canvas beneath to block snowmelt from soaking through. They learned to sleep close together, back to back, when nights fell below zero. Pride might keep a cowboy tough in the daylight, but when the wind howled and snow drifted over the camp, he welcomed the body heat of another man lying close beside him. Survival left little room for vanity. Food played its own role in fighting the cold. Caloric intake was survival fuel, and beans, bacon, biscuits, and coffee became staples. Hot coffee was not just a comfort, it was a lifeline, warming numb fingers and sparking energy in exhausted bodies. Meat, whether jerky chewed slow on a ride or fresh venison from a lucky hunt, gave strength to muscles that otherwise would weaken. Cooking in winter was no easy task. Snow buried kindling, winds fought sparks and frost-numbed fingers. Yet cowboys became artists of the Dutch oven, burying it in coals, letting bread or stews simmer slow beneath iron lids while the storm raged outside. A hot meal at the end of a frozen ride could mean the difference between waking the next morning or never rising again. But it wasn't just clothing, food, and fire that carried them through. Cowboys leaned on their horses as much as their gear. A good horse was a partner in survival, able to sniff out grazing through snow, to keep moving when a man's strength faltered, to stand against the cold with a patience almost human. Cowboys often sheltered behind their horses in cutting winds or even pressed close to them at night for warmth. Saddles doubled as pillows, saddlebags as insulation, horses themselves as silent companions who shared the winter burden. Without horses, many men would have been stranded, frozen on open ground. With them, they pressed on through storms that turned the plains into endless white oceans. Storms were the greatest enemy. One moment the sky might be clear, stars shining like frozen diamonds. The next a blizzard could sweep down, blinding, suffocating, erasing the world in walls of snow. Cowboys caught in such storms tied ropes from one rider to another to keep from losing each other. They turned cattle into the wind, herding them slow and steady to keep them from stampeding in panic. Some men told stories of nights when they sang into the blizzard, their voices the only anchor in a world where sound and sight disappeared into howling void. When the snow piled high, cowboys dug into drifts, carving makeshift caves that trapped enough heat to hold back death. They lit fires in pits beneath snow walls, creating shelters that looked like graves but felt like salvation. It was not comfort they sought, and it was endurance. And every storm survived became another notch in a cowboy's legend, proof of resilience against a land that gave nothing freely. Still, many did not survive. Frostbite took fingers, toes, ears. Some froze in saddles, their bodies stiff by morning. Horses wandering back to camp alone. Others starved when supplies ran thin, or were crushed beneath cattle driven mad with hunger. Winter demanded a toll, and it collected without mercy. Yet those who did survive carried scars that became stories. And those stories grew into the legends we remember today. Cowboys who rode through blizzards and lived to tell about it were admired as men of unshakable grit, almost mythic in their endurance. They were living proof that survival was possible, that even in a world stripped bare of comfort, men could endure with little more than fire, faith, and sheer willpower. The harshest truth about winter on the frontier was that it was not a season you conquered. It was a season you endured, and sometimes the best a man could hope for was to come out the other side with his body intact and his spirit only half broken. The cold worked its way into bones, into minds, into the very will of those who fought it. It was not enough to have a coat or a horse or a fire. A cowboy's most important weapon in winter was his stubbornness, his refusal to let the land claim him, even when every wind gust whispered that it would. Days were long, nights longer still. A cowboy in winter had no luxury of waiting out a storm in comfort. He still rode the line, still checked the herd, still cut through drifts that reached his stirrups. He learned to read the snow like a book, to see in its patterns the story of the wind and the danger of ice. The crust could cut a horse's legs, the drifts could hide gullies, the frozen rivers could swallow a rider in seconds if he trusted the ice too quickly. Cowboys tested each step, listening to the groan beneath hooves, watching for the faintest line that marked where water waited below. The land gave no second chances. One mistake, and you did not get back up. But in those long rides, men found ways to fight the cold beyond layers of wool. They moved constantly, rising in the saddle, stomping feet, shifting weight to keep blood flowing. They rubbed snow across their faces to keep frostbite at bay, the sting of ice preferable to the numbness that came before blackened flesh. They carried flasks not only for water but for whiskey, believing a burning mouthful could ward off the chill for a mile or two. And though the liquor did little more than dull the edges, it was a comfort, and sometimes comfort was as important as heat. Songs carried through the night, voices raised above the wind, reminding cattle and riders alike that they were not yet beaten. The prairie may have been silent, but cowboys filled it with sound, their voices proof of life in a place that wanted silence to reign. Shelter was rare, and when found, it was treasured. A stand of cottonwoods, a rocky overhang, even a half-collapsed barn could turn a night from deadly to survivable. Cowboys stuffed cracks with brush, leaned saddles into corners, and used oiled slickers to block the worst of the wind. Some carried heavy oilcloth tarps, their only barrier between snow and skin. When storms pinned them down, they built fires in hollows, letting smoke vent through narrow cracks while they huddled low. Sparks could scorch, smoke could choke, but it was better than freezing. More than once a man woke to find his hair singed or his blanket burned, yet still he lived, and that was all that mattered. Horses, too, were tested by winter. A cowboy never forgot that his mount was his partner, and in the cold that bond grew stronger. Horses pawed through snow to find grass, their persistence feeding both themselves and the cattle they guarded. Cowboys brushed frost from their coats, wrapped rope blankets across their backs, and shared whatever scraps of grain they carried. A horse too weak to stand meant a cowboy stranded, and a stranded cowboy in January was a dead man walking. So they tended their animals as carefully as their own bodies, whispering encouragement into frosted ears, patting ice-crusted necks, pressing foreheads to warm breath in the still of night. In a world where men fell silent from exhaustion, horses remained steadfast, eyes glowing in firelight, steady as the stars above. Food, too, became a story of adaptation. Canned goods, hardtack, salted pork, all staples of the trail, became even more precious in the cold. Beans boiled longer when snow was melted for water, bread baked denser in Dutch ovens buried in coals, and jerky was chewed slow as the only warmth in a rider's mouth. Some cowboys carried onions or garlic strung from saddles, believing they kept sickness away, though most simply ate them raw to break the monotony. Coffee was brewed so strong it could float a horseshoe, its bitter edge welcome against the numbness of fatigue. When luck struck, a deer or rabbit meant fresh meat, a rare luxury that brought energy enough to endure another week. Cowboys told jokes around the fire about beans for breakfast, beans for lunch, beans for supper, but no one laughed too long. Food was survival, not pleasure, and waste was a sin they could not afford. Time itself moved differently in winter. Days felt endless, yet weeks blurred together. The landscape offered no variety, white drifts, gray skies, endless wind. Cowboys measured time not in hours, but in storms survived, in cattle counted, in fires built and extinguished. Some carved marks into saddles, tallying days until spring. Others scratched in journals, their handwriting stiff and jagged from frozen hands, recording tales of storms, of lost cattle, of close calls in the snow. Around campfires, men traded stories of winters past, each tale a mixture of truth and exaggeration, all designed to remind them that survival was possible, that others had endured worse. Legends grew from those stories of riders who outlasted blizzards 3 days long, of men who thawed themselves in rivers to escape frostbite, of herds saved by one cowboy's refusal to quit. These stories warmed hearts even when fires burned low. But winter was also a season of silence. The frontier, already wide and empty, became lonelier still when snow blanketed its sound. Cattle lowed less, birds fled south, and even wolves padded quiet through drifts. Cowboys rode with only the creak of saddle leather, the crunch of hooves on ice, and the hiss of wind through sage. Silence pressed in on them, magnifying every thought, every fear. Some men cracked beneath it, their minds unraveling in the endless white. Others found peace, a strange calm in the simplicity of survival, the stripping away of everything but the next fire, the next meal, the next ride. Winter demanded focus, and in that focus some found a clarity they never knew in warmer days. Not every cowboy feared winter. Some wore it like a badge of honor. They spoke of it as a test, a proving ground that separated true men from those who merely wore the hat. To say you had wintered cattle in the Dakotas or held the line in Wyoming blizzards was to claim toughness no summer rider could understand. Stories of frostbitten ears, of nights spent buried in snowbanks, of weeks living on beans and black coffee, these became boasts, scars of pride retold around fires for decades to come. A man who could laugh about surviving January on the frontier was a man to be respected, even feared. Because winter was not just a season, it was a forge, and cowboys who endured it came out tempered like steel. The deeper winter pressed in, the more it revealed the fine line between those who survived and those who did not. On the open plains, storms came without mercy, stretching for miles with no tree line to block their fury. Cowboys rode hunched low, scarves stiff with frost, their horses' manes crusted with ice. Breath steamed in great clouds that froze as crystals on mustaches and lashes. Fingers, even gloved, grew numb until reins slipped like ropes of stone, and the simple act of moving a hand to adjust a saddle strap felt like lifting a weight of iron. It was in these moments that cowboys learned what endurance really meant. Not boldness, not bravado, but a quiet refusal to stop, even when every part of their body begged for rest. One of the oldest tricks to keep warm was motion itself. Cowboys knew that stillness meant death. So they rode in patterns, circling herds, pacing through camps, moving even when there was little to do. They swung arms, slapped thighs, stamped boots in the snow until feeling returned. When they dismounted, they led horses at a steady walk, keeping man and beast alive through motion. Fire was salvation, yes, but you could not always stop to build one. Some nights a rider pushed through hours of cold with nothing but constant motion, his body half asleep in the saddle, his horse guiding both of them by instinct. More than one cowboy told of waking from a frozen haze only to find his horse had carried him home through a blizzard he could barely remember. Trust in the animal was trust in survival. Another quiet ally was wool. Before synthetics there was nothing better, and cowboys wore it in layers whenever they could afford it. Wool shirts, wool socks, heavy blankets. The fiber retained heat even when damp, and damp was often unavoidable when snow melted against skin. Cotton froze stiff, but wool held its warmth, clinging to bodies with the smell of lanolin and sweat. Many men swore by wool long johns, though not every cowboy had the coin for them. Those who didn't improvised with whatever scraps they could stitch into lining, anything to hold off the cold. Some rubbed animal fat into clothes, sealing them against wind and snow. It stained, it stank, but it worked. And out here, function mattered more than dignity. Communication in winter became another act of survival. A lone rider was a vulnerable man, but 2 or 3 working together could pull each other through. Cowboys learned to call out in storms, their voices ragged but steady, checking that partners were still within earshot. They tied ropes from saddle horn to saddle horn, an unbreakable line in blinding white. If one stumbled, the others dragged him on. If one faltered, the group kept moving until warmth could be found. Brotherhood mattered in the cold. Solitude was noble in song, but in January, it was often fatal. Cowboys who wintered together forged bonds stronger than steel, and those friendships lasted lifetimes. A man who had pulled you through a blizzard was more than a friend. He was kin, as much family as blood. The cattle, though, never gave pause to the weather. They scattered in storms, lowed in panic, drifted into gullies where snow buried them alive. A cowboy's duty was not just to himself, but to them. He rode through storms not for glory, but because herds depended on him. If cattle starved, ranchers lost fortunes and men lost jobs. Cowboys dug through snowdrifts to expose grass, broke ice on rivers so herds could drink, drove animals mile after mile in search of shelter. Their bodies froze while their cattle grazed, and more than one man collapsed in exhaustion knowing he had saved the herd, even if it cost him dearly. Loyalty ran both ways. The land was cruel, but a cowboy's code was simple. You did not abandon the herd. Even if the wind howled, even if the snow blinded, you rode. As weeks turned into months, winter became a game of rationing. Food, firewood, and stamina were measured carefully, each day a calculation of what could be spared and what must be saved. Cowboys stretched beans with water until they were more soup than meal, sliced jerky thin, divided biscuits so that every man had a bite. Tobacco, when it ran low, was traded and rationed like treasure. A single plug of chewing tobacco might pass through half a camp before the night was done. Firewood dwindled too, and men scoured for sagebrush, deadfall, anything that could burn. On the plains, buffalo chips again proved their worth, filling stoves and fires when wood was gone. The smell was sharp, the smoke heavy, but it gave heat, and in the cold, heat was life. Some winters were mild, others brutal. Cowboys remembered the bad ones for years, telling stories of nights when men froze standing upright, reins locked in their hands, horses pulling their dead weight home. They spoke of blizzards so fierce that lanterns disappeared in arm's length of snow, of herds lost entirely, bodies buried beneath drifts discovered only in spring. Survival in such winters was not guaranteed, and everyone knew it. To set out on a ride was to accept the gamble that you might not return, and yet they rode anyway. Not because they wanted to, but because the work demanded it, because ranches depended on it, because they themselves depended on the wages that waited on the other side of spring. Winter was no excuse to rest. On the contrary, it was the season when every ounce of a cowboy's grit was tested. Yet in the heart of such hardship there were moments of strange beauty. Cowboys spoke of nights when the stars shone brighter than they ever had, sharp and cold against a sky clear as glass. They told of auroras that danced across northern plains, green and red light flickering over snow, so vivid it silenced even the roughest riders. They spoke of mornings when frost turned every fence post into crystal, every blade of grass into a jewel. Winter could be merciless, yes, but it could also be breathtaking, and sometimes that beauty was enough to remind a man why he endured it. To see the world so stark, so raw, so alive, was to understand both its cruelty and its wonder. By midwinter, men grew leaner, faces chiseled by wind, eyes shadowed by fatigue. But they also grew sharper, more resilient, their instincts honed to a razor's edge. They knew the pitch of snow before it broke beneath hooves, the smell of wind before it carried ice, the sound of cattle before a stampede. Survival was no longer guesswork. It was an art, etched into every muscle and nerve. Cowboys emerged from winter harder, stronger, their very being shaped by the season's trial. They did not just endure it, they became part of it, as much a creature of the snow as the wolf or the bison. And that transformation, more than anything, was the true secret of survival. You did not fight the winter. You became someone who could live inside it. As the long winter stretched into its final weeks, cowboys began to mark the changes with quiet relief. The snow softened, the wind shifted, and the light lingered a little longer each evening. Horses that had trudged with weary steps found new energy, and cattle stirred restlessly, eager for green grass buried beneath melting drifts. Yet the end of winter was never simple, never clean. It brought its own dangers, sudden thaws that flooded rivers, storms that returned just when men thought the worst was past, herds weakened by hunger and illness. Spring was not a rescue, it was another battle. But after months of relentless cold, even a glimpse of change felt like salvation. Cowboys who had endured the winter carried it with them, not as scars but as stories. Around campfires, as the land began to thaw, they retold the close calls, the moments when survival seemed impossible, the nights when firewood ran out or storms pinned them in place. Each man's story was different, but all shared a common thread: endurance. Winter was not won with heroics or bravado, but with quiet persistence, with the daily choice to press on. They laughed at their own misfortune, exaggerated their struggles for humor, but beneath the laughter was pride. To have faced the frontier, winter and lived was a badge of honor no words could fully capture. Those stories echoed beyond the camps and ranches. They became part of the myth of the cowboy, woven into the fabric of the American West. Songs carried them, novels embroidered them, films would one day dramatize them. The image of the cowboy, a lone rider silhouetted against snow and sky, pushing forward when all reason said to stop, was not just fiction. It was truth, born in the bitter winds of Dakota blizzards, in the howls of Wyoming storms, in the endless white of Montana plains. The cowboy's survival in winter was more than personal endurance. It was a testament to human will, a refusal to bow to nature's cruelest season. And yet even in that pride, cowboys knew humility. They never forgot that winter had claimed men tougher than themselves. Crosses on lonely hills, unmarked graves in frozen soil, bones found in spring thaw, all reminders that no one truly conquered the frontier's cold. You survived it if you were lucky. You endured it if you were strong. And if you didn't, the land swallowed you whole and moved on without pause. The cowboy's respect for winter was born not from fear alone, but from the knowledge that survival was never guaranteed. When spring finally broke, it transformed the land in ways almost magical. Brown grasses pushed green shoots through the thaw. Rivers roared with snowmelt and the air filled once again with birdsong. Cowboys rode with lighter hearts, their faces still weathered, their eyes still wary, but their spirits lifted by the return of warmth. They shed layers, rolled up sleeves, let the sun touch skin that had not felt its heat in months. Herds grazed eagerly, fattening on new growth, their lowing a sound of relief across the plains. Work continued as it always did: branding, driving, fencing, But the weight of survival was lighter, the rhythm easier. In those first warm nights, cowboys often gathered in celebration. They played cards, strummed guitars, sang songs louder than the wind. Whiskey flowed, laughter echoed, and for a brief moment life felt easy again. But beneath the revelry was the unspoken knowledge that another winter would come, that the cycle would repeat, that once more they would face the endless snow. Perhaps that knowledge was why they celebrated so fiercely. They understood better than anyone how fragile life was, how fleeting comfort could be. Every fire, every meal, every sunrise mattered more after you had lived through nights that promised you might never see them again. Looking back, it's easy to see the cowboys' survival in winter as a kind of legend, a romantic tale of grit and toughness. But to those men it was not legend, it was simply life. They did not consider themselves heroes for pushing cattle through snow, for keeping fires lit, for keeping fingers and toes intact through bitter storms. They did what needed doing, because it had to be done. They survived, because there was no other choice. And in that simple truth lies the deepest lesson of the frontier winter. Survival is not glory. It is work, grit, patience, and above all, an unshakable will. The cowboys may be gone, their trails paved, their ranches modernized, their hardships softened by technology. But the memory of those winters remains, carved into the history of the American West. It lingers in the ghost towns, in the journals left behind, in the songs that drift through dusty saloons. When we picture the cowboy braving a blizzard, face wrapped in a scarf, horse trudging forward against the gale, we are seeing not myth, but memory. Real men lived that life, fought that cold, and endured what most of us could hardly imagine. And perhaps that is why the image of the cowboy endures, why it still stirs something deep in us today. Because in those winters, stripped of comfort, stripped of luxury, stripped of everything but the will to carry on, we see something universal. We see ourselves at our most fragile and our most resilient. We see the simple truth that survival depends not on what we own, but on who we are. And when the snow falls, when the wind howls, when the nights stretch long and bitter, the story of the cowboy reminds us that even in the coldest dark, we can endure. So imagine yourself there, in the saddle on a frozen plain, the horizon swallowed by white, the wind screaming in your ears. Your breath freezes on your scarf. Your fingers ache against the reins. Your horse plods on beneath you, steady and strong. You do not know if the storm will last an hour or 3 days. You do not know if you will make it to camp or if the fire waiting there has gone out. But you press forward. You keep riding. Because that is what the cowboy did. That is what survival meant. And in that endless winter, with nothing but grit to guide you, you understand what they always knew. The frontier did not belong to those who conquered it. It belonged to those who endured it. And that is how cowboys survived winter without modern gear, not with magic, not with miracles, but with stubbornness, with strength, with a quiet determination that no storm could steal. Their story is not just history. It is a reminder to us all that even in the harshest of seasons, survival is possible, as long as we keep moving forward.